A millionaire loses $100,000 suitcase. A humble woman surprises him by returning it. What happened next is unforgettable. Ethan Walker was the kind of man everyone admired from a distance but feared up close. A self-made millionaire, he had built his business empire from the ground up, turning small investments into a fortune. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove the latest luxury cars, and lived in a penthouse that overlooked the city skyline. To the world, he was a symbol of success. But behind the wealth and power, Ethan was a man who had forgotten what it meant to trust, to care, or to be cared for. One rainy afternoon, as he hurried through the bustling streets of New York City, juggling phone calls and business deals, he failed to notice the unthinkable. His suitcase, containing $100,000 in cash, had slipped from his grasp. He had just withdrawn the money for a confidential business transaction, believing that in his world, speed and efficiency mattered more than caution. By the time he realized his mistake, panic set in. Frantically retracing his steps, he barked orders at his assistant to check security cameras and contact the police. "It has to be here somewhere," he muttered under his breath, frustration boiling inside him. But deep down, he knew the truth. Money like that, lost in a city full of strangers, was as good as gone. Across town, in a quiet neighborhood where luxury was a distant dream, Sarah Lawson was walking home from her shift to the diner when she noticed something unusual. A sleek black suitcase abandoned near a street corner. At first, she hesitated. In a city like this, people didn't just leave expensive-looking things lying around. Cautiously, she unzipped it, expecting to find documents, clothes, maybe a laptop. Instead, what she saw made her heart pound: stacks of crisp $100 bills. For a single mother struggling to make ends meet, the sight was overwhelming. The weight of unpaid bills, her son's overdue medical expenses, and the endless cycle of working multiple jobs flashed before her eyes. $100,000. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. A way out of her problems. Her hands trembled as she zipped the suitcase shut. The temptation was real, but so was the voice in her heart, her mother's voice, reminding her of the values she had been raised with. "Do the right thing, even when no one is watching," she had always said. Sarah knew what she had to do. The next morning, after a sleepless night of battling her conscience, she searched for any identification in the suitcase. Tucked between the bundles of cash, she found a business card: Ethan Walker, Walker Enterprises. A name she had heard before, a man who lived in a world so far removed from her own that it felt unreal. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number on the card. "Hello." A deep, sharp voice answered. "Mr. Walker, I think I have something that belongs to you," she said, her voice steady but her heart racing. Silence. Then a cautious, measured response. "Who is this? And what do you mean?" "I found your suitcase," she said simply. Another pause. And then, disbelief. "That's impossible. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to return it." Ethan exhaled sharply. People weren't usually this straightforward. His entire life, he had dealt with people who wanted something from him. Favors, opportunities, money. He didn't believe in acts of kindness without an agenda. "Meet me at my office," he finally said. "No games." Sarah could hear the suspicion in his voice, but she ignored it. She knew the truth. And she was about to prove that honesty still existed. Little did they know, this one act would change both of their lives forever. "Would you like me to continue?" Smiling face with smiling eyes. "You said. Continue in chat." ChatGPT said. Sarah arrived at Walker Enterprises, feeling out of place in her simple jeans and worn-out jacket amidst the towering glass building filled with men and women in designer suits. The receptionist eyed her curiously but, after a quick phone call, instructed her to take the elevator to the top floor. As the doors slid open, Sarah stepped into an office that screamed wealth: floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek leather furniture, and shelves lined with awards. Sitting behind a massive oak desk was Ethan Walker. He looked even more imposing in person: sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and an air of authority that made people nervous. Ethan stood as Sarah walked in, her small frame barely filling the space. His gaze dropped to the suitcase in her hands, and for a moment, an unreadable expression crossed his face. Relief? Suspicion? She couldn't tell. You really found it, he said, more to himself than to her. I did, she replied, placing the suitcase on his desk. I didn't open it, except to look for identification. I knew someone had to be looking for it. Ethan studied her, searching for any hint of deception. And you didn't think of keeping it? Sarah let out a small, humorless laugh. Trust me, the thought crossed my mind. 100 grand could change my life. But it wouldn't change the kind of person I am. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. He had met thousands of people in his line of work. Business sharks, gold diggers, smooth talkers. No one ever did anything for free. There had to be a catch. So, what do you want in return? He asked bluntly. Sarah frowned, insulted by the question. I don't want anything. I just wanted to do the right thing. Ethan leaned back in his chair, still watching her, still trying to crack the puzzle. People always want something, he muttered. Not everyone, she countered. For the first time in a long time, Ethan was at a loss for words. He had expected a negotiation, a plea for a reward, a sob story followed by a request for help. But Sarah simply turned to leave. You could have just walked away, he called after her. She paused at the door, looking over her shoulder. So could you? And with that, she was gone. Ethan stared at the suitcase, untouched, exactly as it had been when he lost it. $100,000 returned by a woman who had every reason to keep it. It gnawed at him, unsettled him. Who was she? And why did her honesty bother him so much? That night, for the first time in years, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about someone other than himself. Ethan couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. He sat in his luxurious penthouse, staring at the unopened suitcase, feeling more disturbed than relieved. He had spent years dealing with deception, betrayal, and greed. Yet, a woman with nothing had just walked into his office, handed him a fortune, and walked away without asking for a single thing. Who does that? Unable to ignore his curiosity, Ethan had his assistant, James, do a background check. Within hours, he had all the details. Sarah Lawson. 32 years old. Single mother. Works 2 jobs. Lives in a rundown apartment in Brooklyn. Her financial records were as bad as he expected. Medical debt, past due rent, and barely enough income to survive. Ethan sat back in his chair, feeling something unfamiliar. Guilt. She had every reason to take the money. Yet, she didn't. The next morning, Ethan made an impulsive decision. He told James to clear his schedule and had his driver take him to Sarah's neighborhood. As he stepped out of his sleek black car, the contrast was stark. The streets were cracked, the buildings worn down, and the people moved with exhaustion rather than purpose. He spotted her easily. Sarah was outside a small, dimly lit laundromat, folding clothes. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her face carried the kind of tiredness that came from years of struggle. Ethan hesitated. What was he even doing here? He had no plan, no reason. Yet, something about Sarah intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain. Before he could turn back, Sarah looked up. Their eyes met, and confusion flickered across her face. Mr. Walker? She asked, stepping forward cautiously. What are you doing here? Ethan wasn't sure how to answer. He had never done anything without an agenda before. But standing in front of this woman, he suddenly felt small. I wanted to thank you, he finally said. Properly. Sarah gave a small smile, wiping her hands on her apron. You already did. You got your suitcase back. Ethan exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. That's not what I mean. Sarah studied him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Look, Mr. Walker, I didn't return your money for a reward. If that's why you're here, you don't owe me anything. That's the thing, Ethan admitted. I feel like I do. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of traffic and the low hum of the laundromat's machines. Finally, Sarah shook her head with a soft chuckle. You really don't understand, do you? Understand what? She smiled, but there was something sad in her eyes. Not everything in life is a transaction. Ethan had no response to that. It was the first time in years that someone had spoken to him without expectation. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want to walk away just yet. He spotted her easily. Sarah was outside a small, dimly lit laundromat, folding clothes. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her face carried the kind of tiredness that came from years of struggle. Ethan hesitated. What was he even doing here? He had no plan, no reason. Yet, something about Sarah intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain. Before he could turn back, Sarah looked up. Their eyes met, and confusion flickered across her face. "Mr. Walker?" she asked, stepping forward cautiously. "What are you doing here?" Ethan wasn't sure how to answer. He had never done anything without an agenda before. But standing in front of this woman, he suddenly felt small. I wanted to thank you," he finally said. "Properly." Sarah gave a small smile, wiping her hands on her apron. "You already did. You got your suitcase back." Ethan exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "That's not what I mean." Sarah studied him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "Look, Mr. Walker, I didn't return your money for a reward. If that's why you're here, you don't owe me anything." "That's the thing," Ethan admitted. "I feel like I do." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of traffic and the low hum of the laundromat's machines. Finally, Sarah shook her head with a soft chuckle. "You really don't understand, do you?" "Understand what?" She smiled, but there was something sad in her eyes. "Not everything in life is a transaction." Ethan had no response to that. It was the first time in years that someone had spoken to him without expectation. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want to walk away just yet. Ethan couldn't forget Sarah's words. Not everything in life is a transaction. It was a concept so foreign to him that it unsettled him. For years, his world had revolved around deals, contracts, and bottom lines. But here was a woman who had nothing, yet still refused something that could have changed her life. Over the next few weeks, Ethan found himself drawn to Sarah's life in ways he didn't expect. He discreetly paid off her overdue rent and medical bills, ensuring she wouldn't lose her apartment or struggle with her son's treatments. He even pulled some strings to get her a better-paying job at a respected company, though she never knew he was behind it. Sarah noticed the changes almost immediately. An unexpected notice that her rent was up to date, a hospital calling to say her son's treatment costs had been handled by an anonymous donor. At first, she was overwhelmed, then suspicious. She knew only one person who might have done this. Storming into Ethan's office one evening, she found him reviewing documents, his face unreadable as always. "You did this, didn't you?" she demanded, placing the medical notice on his desk. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Would it be so bad if I did?" Sarah exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. "I didn't return that suitcase for a handout, Ethan. I don't need charity." "It's not charity," he said calmly. "It's fairness." She frowned. "Fairness? You did something no one else would have done. You showed me that there are still good people in this world. And that's worth more than money to me." Sarah shook her head, still not understanding. "So what? You think throwing money at my problems will make you feel better?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know that for the first time in a long time, I wanted to do something without expecting anything in return. And that's because of you." Sarah studied him carefully. She had assumed he was just another cold-hearted businessman, but there was something different about him now, something real. "I don't need you to fix my life," she said softly. "But, thank you." Ethan gave a small smile. "Then let me do something else. Let me help others like you." And he did. Months later, the Lawson Foundation was launched, an organization dedicated to helping struggling single parents, named in Sarah's honor. Ethan poured millions into it, not for profit, not for business gains, but because for the first time in his life, he had found something that mattered more than money. As for Sarah, her life changed, not because of Ethan's wealth, but because of the friendship that grew between them. She taught him how to care, and he reminded her that sometimes, kindness does come back around in ways we least expect. Ethan Walker, the once untouchable millionaire, had finally learned the one thing money could never buy: human connection. And it all started with a lost suitcase. The end.